There's a specific kind of silence that happens after someone ends a 5-year relationship over a text message. Not the dramatic, cinematic silence you'd expect. Just an ordinary Tuesday evening, my phone screen still lit up with his last message, and the sound of my own apartment humming around me exactly the way it had 5 minutes earlier, before my entire future rearranged itself without my permission. My name is Hannah. I'm 29 years old, and 18 months ago, my boyfriend of 5 years, Ryan, ended our relationship over text, 3 weeks before we were supposed to move in together, with a message that read, in its entirety, "I don't think this is working anymore. I'm sorry." No conversation. No warning I'd taken seriously. Just a door closing, from the outside, while I was still standing on the other side of it wondering what I'd done wrong. What I didn't expect, in the wreckage of that particular Tuesday, was that the person who would eventually help me understand I hadn't done anything wrong at all would be Ryan's own older brother, Marcus, a man I'd known casually for 5 years as Ryan's brother, present at holidays and birthdays, someone I'd never once considered outside the specific, limited context of being attached to Ryan's family through Ryan himself. This is the story of how a breakup that felt, at the time, like the end of everything I'd built my adult life around, became the beginning of something I never could have planned for, and what it actually cost and gave both families, once Ryan had to watch his own brother offer me something he'd apparently never figured out how to offer at all. Met Ryan when I was 24, at a friend's rooftop birthday party, and what drew me to him initially was an easy, breezy charm that made him effortless to be around in the earliest, lightest stages of dating. He was funny, spontaneous, good at making a Tuesday feel like an event. I fell for him quickly, the way you do at 24, when 5 years still feels like an unimaginably long stretch of time rather than the specific, finite chapter it would eventually become. The first 2 years were genuinely good, in the uncomplicated way early relationships often are before real life's actual demands start pressing in. It was somewhere around year 3 that I started noticing a pattern I didn't have language for at the time, Ryan's specific, consistent difficulty engaging with anything that required sustained effort rather than spontaneous charm. He was wonderful at grand gestures and terrible at the quieter, unglamorous consistency relationships actually required to survive long-term, remembering to follow up on things that mattered to me, showing up fully during hard weeks rather than just good ones, having difficult conversations directly instead of letting tension quietly build until it either dissolved on its own or exploded. I want to be honest that I saw this pattern clearly enough, by year 4, that I raised it with him directly, more than once, in conversations that always followed a similar, frustrating shape. Ryan would acknowledge the concern, promise genuine change, follow through briefly, and then drift back into the same avoidant pattern within weeks, never through any single dramatic failure, just a slow, familiar erosion of effort that I kept talking myself into tolerating because the good moments, when they happened, still felt genuinely wonderful. I remember one specific instance, roughly a year before the breakup, that captures this pattern more clearly than almost anything else I could describe. I'd had a genuinely difficult week at work, culminating in a bad day I mentioned to Ryan over dinner, expecting nothing more than a sympathetic ear. 2 days later, seemingly out of nowhere, he showed up at my apartment with an elaborate, thoughtful gift, tickets to a concert by a band I loved, dinner reservations at a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try months earlier, an entire evening clearly planned with real care and attention. I remember feeling genuinely moved by that gesture, and also, in a way I didn't fully understand until much later, slightly unsettled by it, because the same attentiveness that produced that one spectacular evening seemed entirely unavailable to him during the ordinary, unglamorous stretches of daily life that make up the actual majority of any relationship. Remembering to ask how a follow-up doctor's appointment had gone, noticing when I'd been quietly stressed for several days running, the small, cumulative attentiveness that doesn't announce itself as a gesture but that ultimately matters far more than any single elaborate evening. By year 5, we'd started discussing moving in together, a milestone I approached with a specific, cautious hope that shared daily life might finally force the consistency I'd been quietly asking for across years of smaller conversations. I found an apartment. We'd signed paperwork. 3 weeks before the move-in date, that text arrived, and I understood, reading it, that whatever hope I'd been holding onto had apparently never been shared on his end at all, communicated to me only after the decision had already been made entirely without me. I want to pause here and describe what Marcus actually was to me during those 5 years with Ryan, because it matters for understanding just how unplanned and unprecedented everything that came later actually was. Marcus was, for 5 years, simply Ryan's older brother, present at Thanksgivings, at birthdays, someone I exchanged pleasant, surface-level conversation with a handful of times a year, without ever once considering him outside that specific, limited family context. I remember him as quieter than Ryan at these gatherings, often the one helping clear plates or fixing something in the kitchen while Ryan held court telling stories to the room. I liked him, in the mild, uncomplicated way you like your partner's relatively low profile sibling, and I don't think I gave him more than a few minutes of actual thought across the entire 5 years Ryan and I dated. There's one specific memory from that period I've returned to often since, though it meant nothing to me at the time. At a family barbecue roughly 2 years into my relationship with Ryan, I'd mentioned, in passing conversation with several people including Marcus, a stressful ongoing situation with my landlord. Ryan hadn't followed up on that mention at all in the weeks after. Marcus, unprompted, asked me about it the next time I saw him, weeks later, having apparently remembered the specific detail from a conversation he hadn't even been the primary participant in. I noted it, at the time, only as a small, pleasant observation about Marcus being a generally attentive person. I had no idea, then, how significant that same quality would eventually become to me. I want to describe the specific texture of those first several weeks after the breakup, because I think it matters for understanding how unlikely, and how gradual, my eventual relationship with Marcus actually was. Nothing about this began as some immediate, dramatic pivot from one brother to the next. The apartment I'd found for us fell through, obviously, and I ended up staying in my old, considerably smaller place, absorbing a financial setback alongside the emotional one. My friends rallied around me in the specific, well-meaning way friends do after a long relationship ends, though I found myself, more than once during that period, feeling a strange, complicated loneliness even surrounded by people who loved me, a loneliness specific to losing not just a partner, but an entire 5-year architecture of shared friends, shared routines, and, notably, a partner's family I'd genuinely grown close to across those years. Ryan's family had become, over 5 years, something close to my own extended family. His mother had taught me her specific holiday recipes. His younger cousin had asked me, only 8 months before the breakup, to help her pick out her prom dress. Losing Ryan meant losing all of that too, a specific, secondary grief I hadn't anticipated until I found myself, 3 weeks after the breakup, uninvited from a family barbecue I would have attended automatically the summer before. It was Marcus, unexpectedly, who reached out to me directly during that period, sending a message roughly a month after the breakup that read simply, "I don't know if this is weird, but I wanted to check in on you. What Ryan did wasn't right, and I'm sorry you're going through this." I remember reading that message several times, genuinely uncertain how to interpret it. Marcus and I had always been friendly in the ordinary, low-stakes way you're friendly with a partner sibling, but we'd never had any relationship beyond that context, and I hadn't expected him to reach out at all, let alone with something that direct. That I responded to Marcus's message eventually, cautiously, and what followed over the next several months was something that genuinely began as friendship, built slowly, with neither of us initially considering it as anything more than that. Marcus and I started texting occasionally, then more regularly, conversations that began around the shared, awkward territory of Ryan's family and gradually expanded into considerably more personal territory, Marcus's own frustrations with his job, my slow process of rebuilding a sense of identity outside a 5-year relationship, the kind of easy, low-stakes conversation that develops naturally between two people who genuinely enjoy talking to each other, without either of us initially framing it as anything romantic. I want to be honest that I noticed, somewhere around month 3 of this developing friendship, a specific quality to how Marcus engaged with me that felt different from how Ryan ever had, in ways that unsettled me slightly before I fully understood why. When I mentioned something difficult happening at work, Marcus asked detailed, genuine follow-up questions the following week, remembering specifics I hadn't expected him to retain. When I had a hard week, he checked in directly, without waiting for me to reach out first. These were small things, individually unremarkable, but collectively, they represented exactly the kind of sustained, consistent attentiveness I'd spent years quietly asking Ryan for and never fully received. There was a specific week, roughly 4 months into this developing friendship, that I've thought about often since as a kind of quiet turning point, even though nothing overtly significant happened during it. I'd mentioned to Marcus, almost in passing during a text conversation about something entirely unrelated, that I had a difficult medical appointment coming up. At all, let alone with something that direct. I responded to Marcus's message eventually, cautiously, and what followed over the next several months was something that genuinely began as friendship, built slowly, with neither of us initially considering it as anything more than that. Marcus and I started texting occasionally, then more regularly, conversations that began around the shared, awkward territory of Ryan's family and gradually expanded into considerably more personal territory, Marcus's own frustrations with his job, my slow process of rebuilding a sense of identity outside a 5-year relationship, the kind of easy, low-stakes conversation that develops naturally between two people who genuinely enjoy talking to each other, without either of us initially framing it as anything romantic. I want to be honest that I noticed, somewhere around month 3 of this developing friendship, a specific quality to how Marcus engaged with me that felt different from how Ryan ever had, in ways that unsettled me slightly before I fully understood why. When I mentioned something difficult happening at work, Marcus asked detailed, genuine follow-up questions the following week, remembering specifics I hadn't expected him to retain. When I had a hard week, he checked in directly, without waiting for me to reach out first. These were small things, individually unremarkable, but collectively, they represented exactly the kind of sustained, consistent attentiveness I'd spent years quietly asking Ryan for and never fully received. There was a specific week, roughly 4 months into this developing friendship, that I've thought about often since as a kind of quiet turning point, even though nothing overtly significant happened during it. I'd mentioned to Marcus, almost in passing during a text conversation about something entirely unrelated, that I had a difficult medical appointment coming up. Later that week, one I was anxious about but hadn't made a big deal of with anyone else. Marcus texted me the morning of that appointment, simply asking how I was feeling about it, and then texted again that evening, without my having reached out first, to ask how it had gone. I remember sitting with my phone in my hand after that second text, recognizing, with a specific, uncomfortable clarity, that I couldn't actually remember the last time Ryan had tracked something like that across multiple days without my needing to remind him it existed at all. I also want to be honest about the specific guilt that accompanied noticing this, because it complicated everything considerably. Marcus was my ex-boyfriend's brother. Whatever this developing friendship was becoming, it existed inside an enormously complicated family structure, one where any romantic possibility carried real, serious consequences beyond just my own feelings, consequences for Ryan, for Marcus and Ryan's relationship with each other, for their parents, for an entire extended family ecosystem I'd been part of for 5 years and had no idea how to navigate from this entirely new, unprecedented angle. I remember calling my closest friend, Jess, during this period, describing what was developing with a kind of confused, guilty hesitation, half expecting her to tell me I was making a serious mistake even considering it. Instead, she asked me a question that stuck with me for weeks afterward, whether I was more afraid of how complicated this situation actually was, or of how good it felt to finally be with someone who paid this kind of attention to me, and whether I was using the complication as a convenient excuse to avoid something I actually wanted simply because it scared me in an entirely different way than Ryan's inconsistency ever had. The friendship shifted into something neither of us could continue pretending wasn't romantic during a specific evening roughly 5 months after the breakup, when Marcus and I met for what had, by that point, become a fairly regular dinner between friends, and ended up talking for nearly 4 hours about considerably more vulnerable territory than either of us had previously ventured into. Marcus told me something that evening I hadn't expected to hear, about his own complicated relationship with Ryan growing up, a lifelong pattern, considerably predating me entirely, of Ryan receiving more attention and accommodation from their parents as the younger, more overtly charming sibling, while Marcus had spent years developing a quieter, more consistent, less immediately impressive way of moving through the world, one that Marcus admitted he sometimes worried went underappreciated by people who were drawn, initially, to Ryan's more immediate charisma. I told him, in turn, about the specific pattern I'd spent years trying to name in my relationship with Ryan, the grand gestures without sustained follow-through, the way charm had substituted for consistency across 5 years in ways I'd only fully understood once I had months of distance and Marcus's own steady, comparative presence to measure it against. Neither of us said anything explicitly romantic that night. But I remember the specific, charged quality of the silence when Marcus walked me to my car afterward, both of us standing there a beat too long before saying goodnight, both of us, I think, understanding exactly what neither of us was yet willing to say out loud. That it was Marcus, about 2 weeks later, who finally said what neither of us had been willing to name directly. He called me, rather than texting, which felt significant given how much of our friendship had developed over text, and told me, carefully, that he'd been feeling something toward me for several months that had stopped feeling like ordinary. The friendship shifted into something neither of us could continue pretending wasn't romantic during a specific evening roughly 5 months after the breakup, when Marcus and I met for what had, by that point, become a fairly regular dinner between friends, and ended up talking for nearly 4 hours about considerably more vulnerable territory than either of us had previously ventured into. Marcus told me something that evening I hadn't expected to hear, about his own complicated relationship with Ryan growing up, a lifelong pattern, considerably predating me entirely, of Ryan receiving more attention and accommodation from their parents as the younger, more overtly charming sibling, while Marcus had spent years developing a quieter, more consistent, less immediately impressive way of moving through the world, one that Marcus admitted he sometimes worried went underappreciated by people who were drawn, initially, to Ryan's more immediate charisma. I told him, in turn, about the specific pattern I'd spent years trying to name in my relationship with Ryan, the grand gestures without sustained follow-through, the way charm had substituted for consistency across 5 years in ways I'd only fully understood once I had months of distance and Marcus's own steady, comparative presence to measure it against. Neither of us said anything explicitly romantic that night. But I remember the specific, charged quality of the silence when Marcus walked me to my car afterward, both of us standing there a beat too long before saying goodnight, both of us, I think, understanding exactly what neither of us was yet willing to say out loud. That it was Marcus, about 2 weeks later, who finally said what neither of us had been willing to name directly. He called me, rather than texting, which felt significant given how much of our friendship had developed over text, and told me, carefully, that he'd been feeling something toward me for several months that had stopped feeling like ordinary friendship, and that he understood completely if that admission changed or ended whatever we currently had, given how complicated and potentially painful the situation was for everyone involved. I told him honestly that I'd been feeling something similar, and that I'd spent weeks trying to talk myself out of it specifically because of how complicated it was, not because of anything lacking in what had developed between us. We spent that entire phone call, nearly 2 hours, working through the specific, serious concerns both of us had, what this would mean for his relationship with Ryan, what it would mean for both of us within their extended family, whether pursuing this was worth the very real damage it might cause to relationships that mattered to both of us independent of whatever we felt toward each other. We agreed, that night, that if we were going to pursue this, we needed to do it honestly and directly, rather than in secret, regardless of how difficult the conversation with Ryan and the rest of the family was likely to be. Neither of us wanted this discovered rather than disclosed, a distinction Marcus was particularly firm about, having watched, he told me, enough family dysfunction over the years to understand that secrecy tends to compound damage rather than avoid it. Marcus made the decision to tell Ryan directly, in person, before either of us said anything to the rest of the family, a conversation he described to me afterward as one of the hardest of his adult life. Marcus told me he'd rehearsed that conversation for days beforehand, trying to find language that would communicate genuine respect for Ryan's feelings while still being honest about what had developed. He said he'd opened by acknowledging directly that he understood how strange and potentially painful this might feel to Ryan, regardless of how the original relationship between Ryan and me had ended, and that he wasn't asking for Ryan's blessing so much as his honesty, since Marcus had. Marcus made the decision to tell Ryan directly, in person, before either of us said anything to the rest of the family, a conversation he described to me afterward as one of the hardest of his adult life. Marcus told me he'd rehearsed that conversation for days beforehand, trying to find language that would communicate genuine respect for Ryan's feelings while still being honest about what had developed. He said he'd opened by acknowledging directly that he understood how strange and potentially painful this might feel to Ryan, regardless of how the original relationship between Ryan and me had ended, and that he wasn't asking for Ryan's blessing so much as his honesty, since Marcus had no intention of pursuing this secretly or apologetically. Ryan's initial reaction, according to Marcus, was disbelief, followed quickly by anger, not, notably, anger rooted in any lingering romantic feeling toward me, since Ryan had been casually dating other people for months by that point, but anger at what he perceived as a fundamental betrayal of brotherly loyalty, A violation of some unspoken rule about which relationships were and weren't acceptable to pursue within a family's existing social architecture. Before I describe the family fallout in more detail, I want to share something Marcus told me about his relationship with Ryan growing up, because it helps explain why Ryan's specific reaction, and Marcus's specific willingness to weather it, both make more sense with that context included. Marcus described a childhood dynamic where Ryan, 3 years younger and considerably more naturally charismatic, had generally received an easier path through most social and family situations, teachers who found him charming despite inconsistent effort, family members who forgave lapses and follow-through more readily because his warmth made up for it in the moment. Marcus, by contrast, described himself as the sibling who did the more thankless, consistent work, the one who called grandparents regularly, who remembered birthdays without reminders, who generally received less overt praise for behavior that was, in its own way, considerably harder to sustain than Ryan's more immediately charming but less consistent presence. Marcus told me this dynamic had never created serious resentment between the brothers growing up, largely because Marcus said he'd made a specific, deliberate peace with it years earlier, understanding that different people receive different kinds of recognition for fundamentally different, but equally valid, ways of showing up in the world. What surprised him, he told me, wasn't discovering these feelings toward me specifically, but discovering how directly this specific situation forced a comparison between his own quieter consistency and Ryan's more immediately impressive charm, a comparison that had generally stayed comfortably abstract throughout their entire adult lives until my own relationship with Ryan gave it an unusually direct, personal test case. What followed, once the news moved beyond Ryan to the rest of the family, was several genuinely difficult months I don't want to minimize or romanticize, because the fallout was real, and it cost both Marcus and me relationships that had mattered to us for reasons entirely separate from our feelings for each other. Ryan and Marcus's mother, in particular, struggled considerably with the news, caught between two sons she loved and didn't want to see permanently estranged from each other over what she initially characterized, in a difficult phone call with Marcus, as poor judgment on his part. She didn't speak to me directly for several months, a silence that hurt considerably given how close our own relationship had been across the 5 years I'd dated Ryan, before that relationship had ever ended. Several members of the extended family took sides in ways that felt, at times, genuinely painful to witness from the outside. An aunt who stopped inviting Marcus to gatherings she continued inviting Ryan to, a cousin who sent me a lengthy, angry message accusing me of breaking up their family, that I found particularly difficult to absorb, given how much of the actual rupture had originated in choices Ryan himself had made years before Marcus and I ever became anything more than friendly acquaintances. I remember one specific family gathering, a cousin's engagement party roughly 5 months after the news had spread, that Marcus and I attended together for the first time since everything had become public. The tension in that room was immediate and palpable, conversations that quieted slightly when we entered, an aunt who made a point of engaging warmly with Ryan while offering me only a stiff, minimal greeting, a general sense that half the room had already decided how to feel about us before we'd even arrived. I remember standing in a corner of that party at one point, watching Marcus navigate a particularly tense conversation with his uncle, and feeling a specific, heavy guilt about how much normal, easy family connection he'd apparently sacrificed simply by choosing to be honest about his feelings for me rather than quietly walking away from them. Marcus and Ryan themselves didn't speak directly for nearly 4 months following that initial conversation, a silence that visibly weighed on Marcus throughout, since whatever complicated dynamic had existed between the brothers growing up, he genuinely loved Ryan and had never wanted this specific outcome for their relationship, even while remaining unwilling to end things with me simply to avoid the conflict. I want to be honest that there were nights, during that particularly difficult stretch, when Marcus questioned aloud whether pursuing this relationship had been the right decision, not because his feelings for me had changed, but because watching his family fracture in real time, even temporarily, was genuinely painful in ways he hadn't fully anticipated before. Ryan's reaction made the cost concrete rather than theoretical. I remember those conversations as some of the hardest of that entire period, both of us sitting with a genuine, unresolved uncertainty about whether what we'd built was worth what it was actively costing people we both cared about, beyond Ryan's immediate family, our shared friend group, people who'd known both Ryan and me as a couple for years, and who knew Marcus more peripherally through family gatherings, represented its own complicated territory to navigate once news of our relationship spread. Several of our mutual friends took the news with genuine, if cautious, support, having witnessed enough of my relationship with Ryan firsthand to understand, without needing extensive explanation, why Marcus's consistency might represent something meaningful to me. Others were more hesitant, expressing a version of the same discomfort Ryan's extended family had, not necessarily judgment of me specifically, but a genuine uncertainty about how to hold two friendships, with two brothers, that had suddenly become considerably more complicated to navigate simultaneously. One friend in particular, someone who'd been close with both Ryan and me throughout the entire relationship, told me directly that she needed some time and space before she could fully process attending gatherings with both Marcus and me present, a boundary I respected even though it hurt to lose, even temporarily, a friendship I'd valued for years. She did eventually come around, roughly 8 months later, telling me she'd needed that time specifically to work through her own complicated loyalty to Ryan before she could genuinely, rather than just performatively, support what Marcus and I had built. I found her honesty about that process more meaningful, ultimately, than if she'd simply forced an immediate, insincere show of support she hadn't actually felt yet. There was another moment, considerably less pleasant, that ended up mattering just as much to my growing trust in what Marcus and I were building. Roughly 10 months into our relationship, we had our first genuinely difficult disagreement, about a scheduling conflict involving whose family gathering we'd prioritize during an overlapping holiday weekend, a conversation that grew tense enough that I found myself, at one point, bracing for the familiar pattern I'd experienced with Ryan, a disagreement either escalating unpleasantly or simply being avoided until it dissolved unresolved. Marcus did neither. He asked, directly, if we could take a short break and come back to the conversation once we'd both calmed down slightly, a request I hadn't ever once received from Ryan across 5 years of similar disagreements, and then, roughly an hour later, initiated exactly that follow-up conversation himself, working through the actual disagreement calmly and directly until we arrived at a compromise we both genuinely felt good about. I remember thinking, afterward, that this specific, unglamorous skill, the ability to pause a hard conversation and actually return to it, mattered more to my sense of long-term safety in this relationship than any grand romantic gesture possibly could have. Ryan's own relationship with the situation shifted gradually over the following year, in ways that surprised both Marcus and me, though I want to be careful describing this part of the story, since it isn't mine to fully narrate and I've relied considerably on what Marcus has shared with me about his own ongoing relationship with his brother. Roughly 8 months after Marcus and I became public about our relationship, Ryan reached out to Marcus directly, requesting to meet, a conversation Marcus described afterward as considerably more honest and difficult than their first confrontation had been. Ryan acknowledged, according to Marcus, that a significant part of his original anger hadn't actually been about brotherly loyalty at all, but about a harder, more uncomfortable recognition, watching Marcus build, seemingly effortlessly, the kind of sustained, attentive relationship with me that Ryan himself had never managed to build across 5 years, despite having had considerably more time and opportunity to do so. Marcus told me Ryan had specifically admitted, during that conversation, that he'd spent months since the breakup dating other people casually, and had noticed, in each of those newer relationships, echoes of the exact same pattern that had ended things between us, an initial period of easy charm followed by a difficulty sustaining the harder, quieter consistency any relationship eventually requires. Ryan told Marcus he'd started, in the months following our breakup, working with a therapist specifically to understand this pattern, a detail that genuinely surprised me when Marcus first shared it, since therapy hadn't been something Ryan had ever expressed interest in during our 5 years together, despite my occasionally suggesting it as we worked through our own recurring conflicts. I don't want to overstate this reconciliation as complete or uncomplicated. Ryan and Marcus's relationship, as of the time I'm recording this, remains considerably different than it was before any of this happened, more careful, more deliberately maintained, less automatically assumed the way sibling closeness often is before it's ever actually tested by something this difficult. But they do speak regularly again, and Ryan has, gradually, rebuilt at least a cordial, if not fully restored, relationship with me directly, one that involves occasional, carefully managed presence at the same family gatherings, something none of us would have predicted was possible during those first difficult months. I remember the first time Ryan and I spoke directly and civilly since everything had happened, at a family gathering roughly a year after our breakup. He approached me, somewhat awkwardly, and told me, briefly but sincerely, that he was glad I'd found something that seemed to genuinely make me happy, even though he acknowledged it had taken him considerably longer than it probably should have to arrive at being able to say that honestly. I told him I appreciated hearing it, and that I hoped he found, eventually, in whatever relationship came next for him, the specific kind of growth he seemed to be working toward with his therapist. It wasn't a warm conversation, exactly, but it was an honest one, and given everything that had come before it, I found that honesty considerably more meaningful than empty warmth would have been. That I want to describe, separately, how the reconciliation with Ryan and Marcus's mother unfolded, because it took a different, slower path than Ryan's own reckoning, and because I think her perspective adds something important to this story that I didn't fully appreciate until much later. She reached out to me directly, roughly 10 months after everything had become public, asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, without Marcus or Ryan present. I remember feeling genuinely nervous walking into that meeting, uncertain whether she intended reconciliation or simply wanted to finally say directly what she'd been unwilling to say through Marcus as an intermediary. She told me, once we'd sat down, that her initial reaction hadn't actually been about disapproving of me specifically, but about a mother's particular, complicated fear of watching her two sons' relationship with each other become permanently damaged over something that felt, to her in those first difficult weeks, entirely avoidable if either of us had simply chosen differently. She said it had taken her considerably longer than she was proud of to separate that fear from an unfair judgment of me personally, and that watching Ryan's own gradual reconciliation with Marcus over the preceding months had helped her finally arrive at a place where she could see this relationship for what it actually was, rather than filtering it entirely through her anxiety about her sons' bond with each other. She told me, near the end of that conversation, that she could see, clearly, how genuinely happy Marcus seemed, in a way she said she hadn't fully appreciated or acknowledged during the months she'd spent worried primarily about Ryan. That acknowledgement meant more to me than I expected it to, given how close our relationship had been for years before any of this happened, and how much I genuinely grieved losing her warmth during those difficult months when she'd kept her distance from me entirely. That I've spent considerable time, across the 18 months since that original breakup text, trying to understand what this entire experience taught me about what I'd actually needed in a partner all along, beyond the specific comparative relief of finally receiving it from Marcus. I don't think the lesson here is simply that Marcus is a better person than Ryan, though I do think they're genuinely different in important ways. I think the more useful, generalizable lesson is about the specific difference between charm and consistency, a distinction I spent years unable to fully articulate while dating Ryan, and one I only fully understood once I had a direct, sustained comparison to measure it against. Charm is wonderful in small doses, in the early, easy stages of any relationship. It doesn't, on its own, sustain the daily, unglamorous work actual long-term partnership requires: remembering, following through, showing up during the specific weeks when showing up is hardest and least rewarding. I've thought, too, about how much of my own difficulty naming this pattern during my relationship with Ryan came from a specific, common confusion between the intensity of a feeling and the reliability of a behavior. Ryan's grand gestures felt intense, and that intensity, for years, convinced me that the underlying commitment must be equally intense, even as the actual, daily evidence increasingly suggested otherwise. Marcus's consistency, by contrast, rarely announces itself as intensely as a grand gesture does, which I think is exactly why it took me months of direct comparison to fully recognize how much more it actually communicated about genuine, sustained care. I also think, honestly, about the specific cost this entire situation exacted on people who did nothing wrong beyond loving both brothers and finding themselves suddenly forced to navigate an unprecedented family situation none of them had any existing template for. Ryan and Marcus's mother, in particular, spent months genuinely suffering through a conflict she hadn't created and couldn't easily resolve, caught between two sons she loved unconditionally. I don't think Marcus or I take that cost lightly, even while believing, ultimately, that what we've built together was worth the difficulty it caused along the way. That I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone should look to their ex's siblings for their next relationship, or that this kind of situation typically resolves as smoothly as ours eventually did. This was a genuinely difficult, costly path, one that damaged real relationships for real people, some of which are still being carefully, slowly rebuilt even now. What I would ask you to take from this, if anything, is a version of the distinction I spent 5 years failing to fully name in my relationship with Ryan. Pay attention to consistency, not just charm. Pay attention to whether someone shows up during the hard, unglamorous weeks, not just the easy, exciting ones. That distinction, more than any specific person or family situation, is what I actually learned from all of this, and it's shaped how I think about partnership considerably more than the specific, complicated circumstances of who taught me to see it. I also want to say something directly to anyone listening who might be in a relationship right now that feels, in some way, similar to what mine with Ryan eventually became, full of genuine affection but missing the specific, sustained follow-through that actually sustains a partnership over years rather than months. I don't think that pattern always means a relationship is doomed, and I don't think everyone experiencing it needs to end things the dramatic way mine happened to end. But I do think it's worth naming clearly, directly, the way I eventually learned to name it, rather than quietly absorbing years of disappointment while telling yourself the good moments should be enough to make up for everything else. Marcus and I have been together for just over a year now. We're not engaged yet, though we've talked, honestly and directly, about a future together in a way that still occasionally surprises me, given how unlikely this entire path once seemed, standing in my apartment 18 months ago reading a text message that felt, at the time, like the end of everything rather than the beginning of something I never could have planned for. If this story affected you, or if you've ever found something unexpected and meaningful in the wreckage of something that initially felt like an ending, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about what actually matters in a relationship, every day.